G'day, everyone. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and I'm delighted to be back here on our webinar series for 2025. I know we've had, I think, a policy school already, but it's been a while since I've seen a lot of you. So welcome back. I hope 2025 is treating you as well as can be expected so far. I'm delighted that you could join us today, and thanks for signing up. We've had huge interest in this webinar on universities and democracy with Professor George Williams. I do want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And to let you know that, as always, these webinars will be continuing this year, not just our regular policy school series, but lots of other exciting webinars we have planned for the year. So head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find out about all our upcoming events and webinars. You can type in questions for George today using the Q&A box. You should also be able to upvote other people's questions as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And finally, a reminder that this is a live event. It is being recorded and it will be available on our website and our YouTube channel later today. So Australia's universities obviously play a pivotal role in society and our democracy. Universities drive research and innovation. They educate our doctors, nurses, engineers, lawyers, and other professions. They're places that foster discussion, protest and dissent and new ideas. But it's also a sector that's been mired in a lot of controversy recently. Students are plagued by higher HECS fees and increased HECS debt. There's been scandals around unpaid staff wages and high paid vice chancellors. And just to put things in a bit of perspective, the Commonwealth government actually collects more money from students paying HECS than it does from our entire gas export industry paying the petroleum resource rent tax. But there's no doubt that universities play a vital role in our society, and I'm delighted to be joined today by distinguished Professor George Williams, AO, who's the Vice Chancellor and President at Western Sydney University. He's the author of 43 books, including Australian Constitutional Law and Theory, the Oxford Companion to the High Court of Australia and Human Rights under the Australian Constitution. So if you're studying law, George pretty much wrote the book on lots of those constitutional ones. And outside of academia, Professor Williams practiced as a barrister for over 25 years. And I'm sure you will have heard him on the news on many occasions on matters as diverse as freedom of speech, freedom from racial discrimination, Indigenous rights, and the rule of law. George, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Ebony. It's good to be here.
So, George, you've spoken publicly and passionately about the importance of the relationship between your university and the community in which it's embedded. Can we kind of start there with that relationship and why it's important and the role that you think the university plays there in that community?
Yeah, thanks, Ebony. And let me start by also acknowledging I'm on Barramagutigal land here on the Darug Nation in Parramatta. And from my point of view, I mean, that's why we exist as a university. If we ask why we have universities, it's to build a good society, it's to support our community and our students. So if we're not connected to students and community, I mean, what are we doing? It's pretty fundamental, I would say. And from my point of view, I'm a new Vice-Chancellor, just 6 months in, and the starting point for me is understanding the needs of students and community and not assuming those. And I think the sector does need to change, and at my end, it meant you've got to approach this with some humility. You've got to be prepared to change, listen, and move forward. And in our case, I've learned a lot in 6 months about what we need to do differently, and often it is surprising. And it's as basic sometimes as just recognising how much students are struggling at the moment. So one of the big things we've done over the last 6 months is provide free food for students through a Western pantry. And you might say, why is a university doing that? And the answer is because our students can't afford to study and eat. 1 in 2 have got food insecurity, may go without meals. And when you listen, I think you get a sense of what is needed. And our job these days is both food and education, because that's what our students and community need.
Yeah, I mean, that's a stark portrait, isn't it, of just how much students are struggling. And we're going to come to that in a little bit and talk about some of those fees and things. But I was really interested when you first started in the role. You talked in particular about the relationship with the local community and the fact that at Western Sydney Uni, so many of your students there are, for example, the first in their family to go to university. What are some of those other distinguishing characteristics of your university in particular there in Western Sydney?
Yeah, and we are different to any other university. 2/3 of our students are first in family, and that means that they literally have no family experience of what it means to be in higher education. Many migrants, students who might have a background of intergenerational poverty. We've got the highest number of low SES students in the country, the highest number of non-English speaking background students. So we're on the forefront, essentially, of educating the nation by way of providing social mobility. And if we don't succeed, then the nation does not achieve its goals of equality, and we won't achieve those ambitious changes we want when it comes to mobility. I would say, though, there's obviously a lot that's very similar with us for the rest of the community, and that includes big changes we're seeing in society with things like social media being on the rise. And we've got to educate a new generation that's less likely to want to read books, more likely to be online. And that poses big challenges for us in how we connect and listen. And to give you a good example of that, one of my early failures, actually, you always have failures, but one of my early ones was I wanted to hear from our students. We wanted a new strategy, and we set up a Zoom webinar just like this, invited our 50,000 students to a webinar discussion with the Vice-Chancellor. We've got about 20 turning
Yeah.
up, really low. But I have to tell you that any student who turns up deserves a medal. There's no way as a student I would have turned up to a Zoom webinar with the Vice-Chancellor. But we pivoted. We thought, what do our students need? We've got a great social media team. And then we went on Instagram Live and we've got 1,300 students.
Yeah.
Really powerful stories. So I think, that's also a matter of, I think, being a bit humble about these things, changing and recognising we've got to go to where the audience is. And that has changed. And it's not the ABC, it's not the newspapers. We've got to be on TikTok, Instagram, and the like if we're going to connect with the people we need to serve.
Yeah, and if we think about the role that universities play more broadly, we've seen things like Wollongong University recently announcing cuts to several programs, including its history department, and there's often news of job cuts from the sector. What effect does cutting things like history departments from a university have on students and then on democracy more broadly?
Look, I think it's devastating. And I think we live in a moment in time when it's been, well, at least for many, many decades, not more important than to have a history degree, a philosophy degree, to understand how our society works, particularly with these momentous changes we're seeing. If you don't understand how we got here and can't connect through critical thinking to be able to pull those things apart and analyse the society in which we live, then we're on a really difficult course, and particularly when misinformation is so rife. I mean, the humanities are just a key building block to building a good society, yet in this country we have actively dissuaded people from studying these. Of course, we had the Job Ready Graduates program, which we've still got in place. If you want to study those programs, it's the most expensive degree in the country, over $50,000. And despite the urgent need, and despite the fact that this is the degree of choice for women, low SES and Indigenous students, we're essentially saying we don't value this degree. And that's just dumb and
Mm.
really counterproductive for the nation. And, particularly given our politicians tend to be art students, it's somewhat ironic that they have benefited from that, and yet so many of them have now sought to undermine the value of this program.
Yeah, so for people who aren't aware of what that Jobs Ready graduate policy is, how does that impact what people are studying and the fees?
Yeah, people will be familiar with the HEC system, and I studied under that many years ago, and that said students should pay a contribution towards their studies. I support that. I think that's fair. Students do get a big income boost from going to university, but the way it started was at a low level, and the Howard government changed it, again, I think in a reasonable way, to say we won't have a fixed fee, we'll have a fee according to how much you might earn. So law, business, for example, pay a bit higher, some others pay a bit lower. But where the system broke was a few years ago under the Morrison government, where they decided to move from that system to essentially trying to prioritise certain things through a price signal. they said, we don't want people in such numbers to be studying history, philosophy and the like, so let's jack up the price. Let's make it the most expensive, despite the fact that people with those degrees have the lowest incomes on graduation and typically come from the lowest backgrounds, the poorest backgrounds. So it tried to send a price signal, but what it's done is it's actually not led to people changing between programs, and there's some great Australia Institute work on this. You know, a student doesn't change from philosophy to maths. Maths is one of the lowest cost, philosophy one of the highest. They don't shift. In fact, less than 1 in 50, the evidence show, actually shift. What they do is often they don't go to university at all. And so what we're actually finding is those people who had answered as a pathway to a better life, often from poorer families, aren't going to university. Social cohesion is affected, their income potential, their lives are affected. And essentially we're pricing people out of university in their dreams because of this quite economically false assumption that you could manipulate student choice. And of course, it was the wrong thing to do anyway. We need people pursuing arts because that's the ticket to many, many careers. So
Yeah,
that's what we've done as a
absolutely.
nation. We've shot ourselves in the foot when it comes to that sort of program.
Yeah, well, even I was just thinking of your comment there about how it impacts people's decisions. I did a communications degree. I was a first in my family to go to university, and certainly you could not have paid me to do any kind of degree related to maths. So I can see how that would, it would really, people would just not go. Very easy to see how
Well, and if you
people
come
make
from
that
first in
decision.
family, that's right. And you think, I want to take on $50,000. And
Yeah.
many people who take on that degree never pay it off. They never earn the income. So you've got this debt literally for the rest of your life. That affects potentially a chance of getting a housing loan. There's all sorts of flow-on effects from that. And look, this furious agreement, it's broken. The Federal Minister, Jason Clare's recognised that. The Productivity Commission, the Accord, I don't think there's any defenders even in the coalition left. So why can't we fix it? And why aren't we prioritising our students? And the one thing the government has done to its credit is it said we're going to reduce HECS and fix the indexation. That's about a $20 billion package. And it's worthwhile, but to tell you the truth, that really helps the law students. It helps the MBA students who have really large debts with high income potential. It actually does very little for students on those lower incomes who may never pay it off, and actually does nothing for students coming in now facing the fees. And it's a bit like dealing with the housing crisis. We're going to reduce everyone's mortgage, but what about people who want to buy a house now? You do nothing in terms of the price up front. It's
Yeah.
actually the wrong way round. And the modelling shows that costs $20 billion, but to actually fix fees is about $1.7 billion a year, including removing all the distorting impacts of that package. I just think it's policy. It's got it the wrong way round. We can fix it, but we have not done so.
Yeah. Well, these cuts are obviously driven by budgets and they're cost-cutting exercises, generally speaking. And there's been a lot of recent coverage in the news around executive pay of VCs, and the University of Melbourne's Vice Chancellor is one of the highest paid in the whole world. And from 2014 to 2023, remuneration for that position totaled over $13 million. We've just talked about how degrees are going up for students, but there's also things like consultants fees and marketing budgets and all those kinds of things. But to what extent, George, as kind of someone new to the VC role, have universities contributed to their own budgetary crises as we're seeing them develop now?
And I should say there's a great report the Australia Institute's just put out on this by Jack Thrower on the high pay for VCs, which has all the data that you're talking about, and yeah, the extraordinary doubling over different periods, and how VC pay now relates to student fees and the like. And it's a really good and eye-opening report. And I think that, amongst many other things, again shows the deep-seated problems we have and why we face issues of social licence as well as the sector. And I can't speak for other universities, but I mean, in my case, I felt strongly coming into this role, my salary should be benchmarked against the Australian Public Service. There's a remuneration tribunal that does that. It removes it at arm's length, and that's what happened in my case. We may move to that more generally across the sector. I don't know. There were systems like that in the past. But I can understand at a community level where you combine high VC salaries, massive fees for students. They're set by government, not the unis, but still. You add in issues around wages not being paid properly, a long list of things. It's no wonder we're on the nose. And
Yeah.
I think as to whether that's our fault as a sector or not, it's of course a mixed answer. I mean, a good part of it is just government has set the university up in a way that has greatly encouraged corporatisation and moved away from a sense of universities as public entities for the public good. Government funding's plummeted. Universities have made up for that, particularly by international student revenue and other corporate activities. And what now is coming to the crunch is the government suddenly saying, we're not going to increase the funding, but we want you to make all of these changes. And the regulation through international student caps and the like is counterproductive and actually is going to harm a lot of domestic students. But I don't doubt, and in my case, we're looking at things like consultancies, business class travel, catering. It's got to start at the top because, as leaders, we've got to make sure that we spend wisely and take into account, students are our front line. That's what we have to prioritise our money for.
Mm. We know that that policy uncertainty over the international students cap was really deeply damaging last year. What do the next steps look like for the higher education sector in the age of caps and maybe less so under Labor, but very direct interference from the government, I guess?
Look, I'd love to know if you've got any insight. And that's part of the problem. It is so volatile and uncertain. And as a university, we're focused on our students and community, but we can't plan very effectively. I mean, we've got to wait for the election, but we had a big Accord document last year, and there's still momentum behind it, but it was blown out of the water by the international student caps, which came from nowhere. And that was a devastating impact, and us in particular, because we have a pretty low number of international students. It's about 19 a bit percent. Our students come from around the world. The biggest of the programs we offer is actually nursing. And they come here, we train them as nurses, they work in Western Sydney. There's a critical shortage of nurses in Western Sydney. And there's frankly a direct line between that policy and what we're going to see is the quality of healthcare in Western Sydney in 3 years' time. Aged care, you name it. We're just not going to have the people working in those areas. And that's the consequence of that cap. And separately, in our case, we were hit hard despite the fact we have a bed for every international student. We've actually got 25% capacity left because we built for it. So we were doing the right thing. The community needs it. And the policy came in with a national formula. And it really is impacting heavily our ability to service the community and local businesses and the like being hit hard. So I think it was one of those, it's politically driven. But it's too much policy in this area actually is about things other than actually getting good higher education outcomes.
Yeah.
I hope there's good things coming, but look at the US and look at the social license issues. Universities are vulnerable, and we're going to see a lot more before the election, I think, where there's seen to be an upside in giving the sector a kicking.
I want to stick with international students and that housing issue that you mentioned. I find it really interesting you've actually got capacity there because one of the political narratives developing at the moment is that immigrants, but in particular international students, are a huge reason to blame for that housing crisis. You've just talked about having spare capacity there. But overall, I mean, universities play that huge role, as you said, in bringing in workforces for key or training workforces for key areas, and then some of them do go on to stay. What's your view of that political narrative that's developed and how damaging that has been for universities?
Oh, and it's not just universities, it's students. And just focus on international students. So these are people, and we have a lot of students from, could be Bangladesh, India, all sorts of countries, quite a diverse group. Their families often using their entire savings as a family to send them. They can be stuck in visa processing queues for weeks with high levels of uncertainty. And the impact on these students who are incredibly motivated, want to make a difference to their families, often are the people we want to stay in Australia because we need them for nursing and other professions. We're burning them in really bad ways. And, we've had suggestions that international students are the new boat people, for example. It's harmful and wrong. And as a nation, we benefit so enormously by having these people want to study with us. And this is the biggest export industry we have that doesn't involve digging something out of the ground. And we should be celebrating the fact that education is our ticket to soft power around the world, our values. There's all sorts of positives, and we're missing that. And we're focusing on housing, which is just wrong. And as I said, at our end, it's not just the fact we have a bed for every student. But it's actually just the economic impact is enormous in Western Sydney, particularly given cost of living. Large numbers of our students do homestay rather than go into college, which means they stay with a local family, often of a similar cultural persuasion. They pay a few $100s a week, and that actually means that family can pay their mortgage. So it keeps them afloat. Or there's a lot of local businesses that just wouldn't survive. There's one pizza shop not far from here, for example, where we were told that 70% of their pizzas are made for international students, and of the pizzas they make, 100% are made by international students. So there's a lot of small businesses that depend on it. So I think it's the politics just not recognising the value that these students bring, and in our case, the fact that we've planned carefully and our community welcomes and wants them.
Universities obviously play a huge role in research and innovation. We've talked about the high cost of HECS, but at the same time, PhD scholarships are also very low, below the poverty line, if I recall correctly. Thinking about that particular role that universities play, what effect does that kind of impact have on equity and access to postgraduate study, and even that pipeline of students who apply for PhDs, and the kind of work that postgraduate students produce?
Yeah, and for postgrad and undergrad students, if you're not coming from a wealthy background, the system at the moment means prepare for poverty too often. And, I see a lot of that. And we have a high dropout rate because it's very hard to study when you're in poverty. And if I start with the undergrads, I mean, youth allowance is $47 a day. I mean, try doing that in Sydney. And that's, of course, for people living away from home. And then when we look at PhD students, the best and the brightest, that's $87 a day. So that's higher. But the median rent per day in Sydney is over 100. So if you're a PhD student, $87 is the government support through the stipend or through us. Just your rent is over 100. And that's why, even with our food pantry, we can find PhD students asking for food, essentially, to get through their studies. And that's a 3 to 5 year program. The country desperately needs those people. They're the people with the big ideas, the brightest initiatives in the most specialised areas. Could be medical research, could be engineering, could be anything. Could be a great historian, you name it. And we've set up a system where it's impossible to live for those people unless they take on a lot of extra employment. And we've seen a big rise, a 50% rise in students working full-time and studying full-time across the nation. Doing one of those is hard. Doing both of them, and what I find in talking to students is they very often say, look, I'm absolutely on the line. It only takes one thing to break me. And it might be someone sick. It could be a child in the family. And it should not be the case that, to study and get ahead, you are in poverty for a few years. But that is the story, sadly, for too many students. And PhD students are in the thick of it.
Mm. I just want to remind our audience that you can put your questions for George into the Q&A box, and it's only me online today. So if you've got a question in the chat, I won't necessarily see it. So if you've got one there, do make sure you send it across there. George, I also wanted to ask, I guess, about that role of innovation and research and the connection, I guess, with business, not just small business in an area, but obviously the role that universities play in educating the workforce, but also pure research and the connection to developing vaccines and things like that. Would you be able to talk a little bit to that role that universities play that might not necessarily be visible to people at large?
Yeah, maybe not visible, but of course critically important. And yes, you think about the research that underpinned our pandemic response, the vaccines. At our university, we're focused on sustainability, clean energy and the like. And to navigate these big world and national problems, it takes great uni research to do it. That we're the engine room of solving these sort of problems. The system is not well set up for that. The government doesn't subsidise that. In fact, it's cross-subsidised by international students. And that's, again, an issue with the caps coming in, that if the government fixed that and fixed the cross-subsidisation, it might be more feasible, but caps essentially mean less research and also less money for supporting domestic students. But it's a vital part of what we do, and it's where I think the ethos of universities really matter. Free inquiry, the willingness to ask really hard questions, to get into uncomfortable zones. And very often you find that the best researchers are the ones who are challenging the orthodoxy.
Mm.
And in our case, we're really keen to focus on those issues that bring the community benefits. We're focused on the applied research, and that might be new medical devices or helping people with disabilities, do a lot of work with Indigenous peoples. And that's the job of a university, to be the place where you can freely debate things and bring forward the big new ideas that push society forward. And imperiling the university's mission means that, well, that's again a big loss to society. We've got to get the balance right.
And we have seen, I think, a lot of kind of political campaigns in recent years that really target that idea of what free speech is on universities and concerns about, I guess, rampant wokeness. Not that many people understand what that kind of thing is. Would you be able to speak to, I guess you've got the background now as not only being a VC, but your background as a constitutional law expert on universities being a real place, not only for ideas, but for dissent and discussion and the importance of that? Um,
Yeah, I feel that really strongly. I mean, I led a law school for a long time, and they specialised in dissent. It was rare to find a day go by where I didn't have multiple people disagreeing with me on some front, and it was good. And I think you make better decisions when you have that. And that's the power of universities. It's got to be a place where students can disagree. We want people to disagree well and respectfully, but it's got to be a place where we avoid groupthink and people feel free to explore and express ideas. And that means also protest too. I mean, what we've had though in Australia is this has become so politicised, as it had elsewhere. Under the Morrison government, it was all about freedom of speech. And we had a freedom of speech model code that came forward. Universities repeatedly hit over the head and required to adopt a new code, which is very liberal and very open in terms of free speech. And of course, the world has now turned. And for good reason. You can understand why with hate speech and other things we need to clamp down, and we've got to draw lines. But this is a very contested area, very hard to navigate, because free speech itself, as a barrister I've seen, is you can't define it. It's really difficult to navigate. And when it becomes politicised, there's so many grey areas here. You can do your best, you can make good decisions, but where there's an attempt to overtly politicise things, you're on a hiding to nothing.
mm, mm. So I think we'll go to questions from the audience very shortly, but I guess you've been in the role now, as you said, for around 6 months. What are the key things that you think need to change in the sector that you'll be focusing on, not just for your university, but for some of those wider problems confronting the sector?
I think the sector, I think we need to acknowledge where we've got it wrong. I think that's a starting point. And I think the sector's often far too defensive on these issues. And I think we have to reflect the fact that the community has concerns, and very often they have been legitimate. And I think until we do that, you can't move past this. You can't get to a better place. And that means on things like wages, and there's a long list of things you've mentioned. We've got to listen, respond, and act on that basis. And I think also more broadly, I think we have to communicate to the community why we're here. And we're not here for dollars. A bottom line for me is not the profit or anything like that. In fact, we're a non-profit, of course, but the bottom line is the students who graduate and what they do afterwards. That's what matters. Connect to that and then actually demonstrate that we are valuing that and show the community, tell the stories, of our great students, what they're doing, the value we're adding, and rebuild confidence. I think more broadly, there's a host of issues about the unsustainability of budget models and things, and that goes back decades and now has come to sharp focus. And unless we have governments willing to support the sector, then the sector is in a bad and difficult position because it's been built on international students with government encouragement. That's been capped. It's now very hard to know where the sector will turn.
We are going to go to questions from the audience now. I can see we've got a few hundred people live and on the line with us. So if you've got a question for George, please put it in the Q&A box there. The first question I've got is from David Carr, who says, great presentation. Thank you very much. That Universities have become profit centers, largely due to bad political interference, but not always. How do we change that system so that universities educate needed and skill trained students?
And I think, I mean, partly it's government settings, but I think it's also, in my case, I focus on what I need to do as a leader of a university. And it's why from day one, I've said that, we're a public institution for the public good. We are not a corporation. And in emphasising what we are here for at Western Sydney University, it's helping our students succeed, delivering impactful research, and we need to be the uni that Western Sydney deserves and needs for its growth and development, particularly given not only the disadvantage, but the extraordinary opportunities we have. So I think the short answer is focus on why we're here and make decisions accordingly.
Mm.
And I've said to my community, you can challenge me, but this is what I'm doing, and ask people to challenge me if I deviate from that.
The next question that I've got is from Anthony, who says, "Thank you for always raising important issues. As an academic at a group of 8 university, one gets the impression that the balance between funds at the delivery level, i.e., teaching, research, and services, often lose out to funds for strategy and risk management, marketing, and those kinds of levels. What's the balance that we should be aiming for?"
Yeah, and I think, and you need to support things like risk audit. There's a lot of compliance things, and it's also the fact that the amount of compliance on universities has just multiplied enormously. We're becoming one of the most regulated industries in the country. There's probably more coming, and that's really expensive. You can think of foreign arrangements legislation, foreign interference. It's really incredible. And the sad truth of that is that's costly, and unis have no choice actually but to address that. Otherwise, you get in trouble with the law. I mean, it'd be good to wind some of that back actually, but the social license issues are leading to over-regulation, I think, and higher cost. But the starting point is for me, unis exist for teaching and research. That's where the money goes. Anything beyond that needs to service that. It doesn't exist in its own right. So you don't have marketing just because marketing has value. You have marketing because you need to support the teaching and research. And it means at our end and others, I think you focus on the front end and then you look at what you need to support it. And I think particularly as universities and like us and others come under increasing pressure, I mean, my job is to preserve that front end mission. And that'll be some hard decisions across the whole sector. But again, that's what we're here for. So make decisions accordingly.
The next question is from Louise Nunn, who says she believes that international students studying a PhD in Sweden receive the same stipend as Swedish domestic students. And is this a model that the Australian government should consider?
Look, I think we could consider almost any model but our own. I mean, as it's just dreadful. And as I say, it's a recipe for poverty if you don't have a wealthy background. Yes, Sweden, the Scandinavian countries, there's a number of countries. I would say, though, in some of the others, there's been a retreat from government support for students generally. It's not just here. And, I'd like a debate that actually recognises what students bring. As I say, I'm up for a HEC scheme. I think that's good. It's fair enough that you contribute back, but you're not helping particularly those in need to get through their studies in the first place. And there's something wrong with education in this country when a university like us has to put on a food pantry and has to help our students just get fed each week. Otherwise, they drop out. And we've had 3,500 students nearly just since we introduced this a few months ago, 3,500 visits. So yes, we can do more. And I think you ask what our priorities are as a society. And for me, I think if you want to be a good society, start with young people, give them a great start in life, set proper fees, give them support, and it will repay in dividends in terms of social cohesion, a good community, and what we value. But I think too often we specialise in intergenerational inequity as opposed to actually recognising now's the time to give someone a hand and they'll repay it back in spades later in life if you do it well.
The next question is from Matt Wilkinson, and he says, "Do you have a view on the publish or perish culture that swept through Australian universities and global universities, and finding the right balance between immediate measurable research output and longer-term research quality and influence?"
Yeah, that's a good academic question, Matt. I reckon you work at a university, and look, I mean, I published 43 books, so I published a lot. I don't recommend that. That kept me a bit too busy at times. But I think at different times what's happened is measures have come in that have said you need to publish, just publish more. And it's where often, again, the basics go wrong in the sector, as opposed to prioritising quality, thinking, originality, and the like. It's often been numbers. And so people for a good period of time were rewarded on numbers. And guess what? Often they published low quality material in poor areas that nobody read. And so I think actually, focusing on the quality and having disciplinary specific measures for that is the way to go. And I think also we need to have not just yearly targets, but often multi-year targets. Sometimes the best research takes a bit longer. But I also, I would say, I'm of the view, if you're a researcher, you do need to publish. I think it's fair enough as an employer, we'd say there's minimum standards that we do need you to publish at whatever is a reasonable cycle for your discipline. But we give you flexibility and autonomy as to how you, once you've met that minimum threshold.
The next question is from Sunny Huri, and their question is, why did Western Sydney University have students arrested for protesting against genocide, and about partnerships between the university and weapons manufacturers? I wonder if you could speak directly to Western Sydney Uni first, and then I'd like to follow up with kind of broader questions for the sector.
Yeah, and thank you. And I welcome the question. And firstly, when it comes to our investments, one thing I've initiated is a review of that. And I did have students writing to me with concerns. So I've written to our people, asked what we're doing, we're reviewing our policies and the like, and we have an ethical responsibility when it comes to our investments. And even if they're at arm's length, as they often are, through a third party who's the investment manager. So that's actually something we're looking at the moment. When it comes to the protests, we had protests in October. The police came to our campus. That was their operational decision to do so. I have to be careful because there were arrests and people are currently before the court. But what happened was that the police arrested some people. They believed and alleged that those people may have committed some crimes, particularly relating to assault and the like. And so they're now going through the courts. And that's what happened. And in our case, I would say that we didn't invite the police, but we will cooperate with them fully. And in my case, I strongly welcome protest. I've actually represented protesters in the courts often, but also, and I'm not saying it's at all to do with that situation, but generally, we're taking a firm line on hate speech and things like that, as the sector needs to. And protest is welcome, but it's got to be within reasonable bounds. And in my case, I've even offered training to the students for future protests to say, how can you do it safely? If the police turn up, how do you navigate that? I don't want you to get arrested. How can you get your point across vigorously and loudly without getting in trouble? We want an active campus, but people have got to be doing it safely for themselves and people around them.
And I want to follow up with two questions. One is the Australian Institute in the past has also looked a little bit into or observed some of those partnerships, not just with weapons manufacturers and partnerships that exist like that between universities, but also sponsorships from things like fossil fuel companies and some of those other really controversial kind of, I guess, sectors of the economy. How can universities better manage some of those things, particularly where there's either an ethical or kind of a conflict of interest that appears, when you've probably got climate scientists talking about the need to end fossil fuel subsidies and stop the expansion of fossil fuels, and at the same university, perhaps taking millions in sponsorship from gas and coal companies, for example.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we're looking at the moment. And it's not just, as you say, what we invest in. That's a fair point, but also the work that we do. And there's something that I need to balance here as a university leader. One is, a clear ethical framework for the university, but also I also need to respect academic freedom as well. And I'm not going to impose, I suppose, a generalised sense on staff to say this is who you work with or this is who you don't. There are many, many grey areas. And take a fossil fuel example, someone who wants to work supporting one of those companies with actually inclusion and access for people with disabilities within the company. It's got nothing to do with supporting the negative fossil fuel outcome, but there are reasons you would work with them in other areas. And I think, again, free speech, academic freedom means that you do need to address these things carefully as to how you do it, but within an ethical framework. And there are clearly some lines. And so, for example, it might be gambling and others. We think about who we receive money from. And I think as a sector, yeah, there's more work to do there. I'd also say at our end, at Western Sydney, there's a particular focus on sustainability. This is big for us. And I want to spruik us for just a moment because one thing we're very proud of is we have the ranking of being the #1 university in the world for meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Oh,
Yeah,
congratulations.
so we're the only uni in the country that is ranked #1 for anything when it comes to a university ranking. And that's frankly the one that matters. So it's how we are actually helping this planet to be a more livable place. It's about gender equity, mobility for women. And so for us, it's actually in our DNA. And we actually want to be the first nature positive university in the country by 2029. So that's the path we're on. And so it's a good question because the whole uni has to be geared actually to that goal of us contributing to the planet being a good place to live as opposed to contributing to the problem.
Mm. I had a follow-up question going back to protest and dissent and human rights. In the past, you've been a strong advocate for a Human Rights Act. And I think we had a question in here. Yes, Christine Klugman asked, how would a Human Rights Act affect universities? And I guess I wanted to think about that also in the context of globally, we've seen crackdowns on university protest and things, and it is in direct tension sometimes with that idea of academic freedom and things like that. But Australia doesn't really have anything in place. We have a lot of implied rights. Can you talk to us a little bit about a Human Rights Act and why you think that would be an important reform for
Sure,
Australia?
my pleasure. Look, I've done a few of these events for the Australia Institute, and thanks, Christine, for the question as well. And look, I think, yeah, I've supported this for a long time because I think it would make a difference to those most in need in the community. But for universities, we need something like that because it gives us a framework to resolve these really tricky issues. We've talked about freedom of speech. One of the reasons it's so hard is because there is no standard in the law we can apply. You've got 42 unis doing their own things with their policies. And as a nation, I actually think we should have a clear commitment to freedom of speech. It should be written into the law. We would comply with it as any public sector organisation would, and would also give a mechanism to resolve these things in fair and appropriate ways. But I think the absence of clarity about human rights means often human rights are poorly protected and inconsistently protected.
And as a follow-up question, Miriam Frommer asked what is the constitutional status of free speech in Australia? She comments that she's got an uneasy feeling that our understanding is really swamped by the US position and constitution, and we don't really understand that our rights aren't the same as theirs necessarily. Do you have any comments
I
on that?
do, and look, I can sense there's probably a few people writing essays and the like, but that's fine. I'm happy to help. And I think, the position is it's not protected in any general and meaningful way. At best, we have this implied freedom of political communication, which the High Court has very rarely applied. And the absence of protection is telling in the vast number of laws we've had passed nationally that directly target freedom of speech. It wasn't so long ago we had raids on journalists in this country. We have offences that mean if you reveal secrets, even in the public interest, even revealing the potential for corruption, you can be jailed for doing so. And we have quite as the New York Times called us, maybe the most secretive country in the world, secretive democracy, I should say, in the world. So as a nation, we actually don't prioritise freedom of speech, and yet it's so politicised.
Mm.
And you've got to get the fundamentals right, I think, to deal with those things. And one issue that the question does point to is people don't really know that. I found that when I led the process in Victoria that led to the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, went around Victoria asking people, do we need a charter? They very often said, no, we've got the National Bill of Rights. In fact, nearly 2/3 of Australians think we've got a National Bill of Rights with freedom of speech. When
Yeah.
I asked Victorians what's in the National Charter of Rights, they said freedom of speech, we know we've got that. And the second thing they mentioned most often was they know they could take the fifth if they. So there's a lot of Victorians and the rest of the country ready to advocate for their US Bill of Rights entitlements. And again, misinformation, the problems in society, it goes to the bedrock often of why political debate is so fraught and why we can just go around in circles and often why the most vulnerable people miss out.
Mm. Anthony has a different question that I'd like to put to you just for my own personal interest, exercising my prerogative as host. He asked about the Trump presidency already highlighting how fragile things like international aid and international law can be. And how important do you think education at university levels is for not only Australia, but the region's kind of long-term development and maintaining that kind of international rules-based order?
Yeah, look, it's again, I accept the premise of the question.
Mm.
And I think if you want to build a good society, you need strong universities able to educate all comers and to enable any person from any background to achieve and have a good life. And that social mobility is critical. But also what universities do is they actually educate people more broadly as to the world. If you want an insular country focused on parochial national interests, have a poor university system. If you're in a country that's focused on the world, on solving the big problems, climate change, and actually building harmony and cohesion in a region, it will support your universities and encourage things like the humanities, encourage mobility, encourage international students. One of the most powerful things is when our domestic students connect with international students and learn about Bangladesh, Philippines, India, whatever it might be. So the mobility of education is powerful. And in my view, and why I feel so grateful to be in this job, is my firm belief, if you want to change the world, start with education. And I've learned that if you don't get that right, that's when things go off the rails very badly.
Terence Hull says that the impactful research task of universities is limited by the small budget of the ARC and the NHMRC, where less than 1 in 5 grant applications are even partially successful. The question is about, will any party campaign on increasing R&D for a better nation? That might be one for the political parties, but if those two bodies are really governing research, is there any important reforms needed to the way that process happens?
We've had some, and to give credit to the government, I think restoring some independence to the Australian Research Council is good. We had the vetoing of grants, and we've had that cycle where people get grants and on talkback radio, the gotcha moment, they read out a title and suddenly it's all illegitimate without understanding actually what it's about and the value of just free inquiry sometimes and how that contributes to our community. And so I think there have been some good changes, but I think the most important thing is the woeful underfunding. And that's declined over time. And so the success rates get lower and lower. And it has this two-tier system of people who can access that and those that can't. And particularly for the humanities, and you look at changes in New Zealand, for example, cutting out that funding, there's real dangers here that we will see what we've seen in student fees, essentially prioritising vocation, and it might be engineering or things like that going more so. And we've seen the seeds of this going more so into grants, that unless you're doing something vocationally oriented, as opposed to contributing to thinking, critical thinking in society, then you're not worthy of that support. We've got to turn that around. And I just think unis have to be vocal and powerful advocates for the humanities because they're the lifeblood. And the research system, unfortunately, is headed in the wrong direction and should be turned around.
Oliver Stelling and I think someone else, maybe Roy, had questions around the rise of AI and generative AI. Oliver's question was around it helping propagandists to spread disinformation. I think Roy's was on the challenge of generative AI in university education, in assessment and fostering critical thinking and creativity. Can you talk a little bit about the rise of AI and what needs to happen in that space?
Yeah, the questions aren't getting any easier.
Yeah, sorry, we're just
So
going to
that's
solve
good. This
all
is a
the
good
world's
question. I've been
problems
thinking
in
a lot
this.
about this one as well. And I think, look, as we know, AI is here to stay. And the thing I'm grappling with is that we need to admit students this year who in a few years will emerge in a very different workforce where AI, it's already coming to the fore even more. So how do we prepare them for the jobs that don't even exist yet? How do we, get them ready for change, disruption, opportunity? And for that, it's, a very different set of skills. Again, it emphasizes humanities and things like that because adaptability, creativity, flexibility are really important in this changing world. And I think we have to embrace that. I'm very much in the glass half full. I know the dangers, but I think the job of a university is to embrace and guide in ethical and appropriate ways. I'd also say that we have to have our eyes open as to the challenge. And, in my field, I actually did this with ChatGPT. I asked it to set a question on bills of rights, set a very good question. I asked it to mark the question. I asked it to answer the question, gave me a very good answer. And then I asked to grade it, and it gave a distinction, which was probably right. So it actually set the question, answered it, and graded it for me all at a high level. So we have to ask ourselves as content generators, what do we do? And from there, the segue for me is, well, the next time I set that, get ChatGPT to answer it. But really the test is pick the holes in it, what's wrong, and how do you improve it? How do you actually set assessment around how people are going to work in the modern world? And with kids coming through, they're embracing it. We have to as well. And we've got to do it in a smart and appropriate way.
Mm. And I've also been really interested in, the actual programming aspect of AI and the things that it does get wrong. And because it is programmed by humans, the embedding of, discrimination and things like what data is going into it.
Well, the problem with
Um,
any machine learning system is it bases itself on the past.
mm,
It can't base itself on things that haven't been written yet. So any system will embed biases unless it's well programmed, racial, you name it. And there's a great danger with AI that we replicate our past mistakes. And again,
mm,
that's for me, as say training lawyers, then the key is to be able to pick that apart and to understand it and to be an interrogator and a critical user. And that the value of universities actually is, again, critical thinking is about the most important thing you get from universities. That
mm,
plus AI is powerful and we can do wonderful things. But without the critical thinking, it's a tool potentially for evil because of the biases and problems it can lead to.
mm. Yeah, we've certainly seen that happen fairly quickly. I've got a couple of other questions here. Simone Abbott says that the University of Canberra ran a wonderful festival that went over the course of almost a month, presenting research and findings specific to its schools and showcasing its strengths. And does the University of Western Sydney offer anything similar? And what roles do those types of activities play in getting the community to, I guess, engage with the university and to make sure it's part of the community?
Yeah, I like that question, and not quite in the same way, no. And it's partly because we have so many campuses
Mm,
too. And Western Sydney is unique in the scale of what we have to cover geographically, but also people. 2.7 million people in our backyard. We are 10% of the Australian population we need to service, both the most wonderful opportunities and also the biggest disadvantage. And so to service that, we've got campuses, could be Penrith, could be Campbelltown, Parramatta, we're up in Blacktown, all over the place. And so for us, it's quite a decentralised model. And obviously at the University of Canberra, you can do it differently. But I think, I agree strongly where it's coming from. I'm very strongly of the view universities need to be much more integrated with their communities. It actually came into this job, and my mantra is we've got to break down the walls between us and society. I love the fact we're inviting high school students onto our campuses to do their study. Industry partnerships are great. We're there for mutual benefit. And also I'm looking at other ways that we can just break it down, even by things like live music on our campuses. We've got wonderful facilities, live music, sport, and we need to activate and get more students on campus.
mm,
And the more it's community-based, the better, actually, in my view. Because we can't be silos. We've actually got to be, in our case, we've got to be the anchor. We've got to be the anchor institution of Western Sydney.
mm. I was really interested in your comments there on inviting high school students to study because I think particularly for that role we were talking about as first of a family to come, it's just such a black box of not knowing what you don't know when you get to a university and
So how
there's
do you
so
break
much
that
to
down?
learn.
Get them early, and
Yeah,
reaching
get
out
them
to
in
high
there.
schools is good. We've got that, but it's actually even better if they come and study, and maybe even we give them a bit of help when they're in the HSC as well, and suddenly it's not as scary as it might
Mm.
be. But it's also where the social media is really important as well. We just have to be where they are, though I would say it does come with its cost. I talked earlier about, we're doing a fair bit of social media. I'm probably the first VC on TikTok, which I tell you, I've never been out of my comfort zone as much as I have in this job. But it's good. You've got to do that as a leader. But the cost was actually a good cost in my case. Was my daughter, 14-year-old daughter, learnt I was on TikTok and said that she will not use the platform anymore. And she actually said, Dad, you are lame and a try hard. You should not be on social media, which meant I'm actually in the right place. And I tell you what, Anthony Albanese, we do not need to ban social media for under 16s. Just get the parents on.
Mm.
Kids will flee in no time.
We'll sign up the dads of Australia to TikTok and
Oh, look, dad
resolve
jokes
lots
and
of
TikTok is
problems.
lethal to youth interest in the platform. But I think that's the message. You've got to be there. You've got to be authentic. You've got to be there. And the people I need to communicate with, and it's wonderful to do this, but my target audience is 14 to 23 in large part. They're the people I need to connect with. And as you say, in terms of high school students, I need them to feel as if there's a world of opportunity for them, and we can give them a leg up, and that we'll look after them. They'll be well treated, and that they can come out with a better life. That's essentially my job.
Mm.
And I come from a low SES background myself, so this is really personal. I think I had these wonderful opportunities, and I just think everyone should.
Absolutely. And it always makes me think of, if we're not pulling in people who that's not, the natural pathway that their life would take, all of that wasted potential, is just enormous when you think about it,
It's
in
wasted
those
potential
terms.
without a doubt. So there's the economics, but also it's the cost, because the alternative is often people are bitter. They
Mm,
know they've missed out on an opportunity. They think society has let them down, often with good reason. And that might be they've come to uni and dropped out because they can't afford it, and they're left with a debt but no degree. So, we're thinking about social cohesion in this country. The best way of building social cohesion is a great education opportunity, put you on a path to great life. So, and it's again what our whole education system is rife with problems at the moment, and not even at our end, but the fact that we've seen such a massive decline in students finishing high school, about 10 points
yeah.
drop just in a recent time. That for me is one of the most concerning indicators we have in this country, that so many kids are just missing out even getting to the end of high school.
Mm, mm. We're going to have to wrap up shortly. I've got two questions that I'd like to put to you, and if you can answer both in these next couple of minutes, that would be appreciated. So, Ian Lang asked about, compared to Europe and other places, Australian universities seem to produce fewer public intellectuals who challenge undemocratic government policy. And Jennifer Bowen asks, and you might finish up with this one, about your understanding of the public good and the extent to which it has currency at this time. I thought that might be a nice, wide
Yeah, again,
philosophical place
two.
to
Look,
end.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Again, both really good questions, and I think Ian. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, of course, it's a scale issue as well. I mean, Europe's a big place. We've got 27 million people. But nonetheless, I think there's a cultural difference. There's the tall poppy bit. I think when I was actually a young academic, actually at ANU, I started doing some media and talking about things, and I was told I was cheapening the discipline and I should stop doing media things. And I thought, no, I'm not going to stop, because if you're not explaining to the community, what's the point? You've got the message. And I was then told that some things were too hard for the community to understand. So I think there can be academic cultures around those things. And I think we should celebrate our public intellectuals and celebrate divergence and difference between them. We need a good debate about these things. But again, Ebony, it comes back to humanities often, critical thinking, a willingness to engage on those things, as opposed to just being very utilitarian about what university's about. And the public good, as I say, I think unis are here for public good. We're public sector organisations. We have to be judged on what we deliver for the community. That's the bottom line. Everything has to be directed to that. And for me, public good, as I say, simple here at Western Sydney Uni. It's, are we propelling our students to success? Are we delivering research that's improving life on this planet and the well-being of our community? And are we actually serving our backyard, Western Sydney, which is this wonderful, vibrant, diverse community? If we're doing those three things, that's what I see as public good. And if we're not, then we're failing in our mission. But, I'm really convinced we've got wonderful people here, great path. And as I said, I just feel really lucky, because I think actually as a university, we can make a difference in a positive way.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor George Williams, VC at University of Western Sydney. And thanks everyone for your amazing questions. I think there was a couple that we didn't get to, but I think we got to almost all of them. And thanks for your great commentary and engagement as well. We really appreciate it. For those who haven't seen it yet, if you like to stay up to date with politics and what's happening, the Australia Institute has launched its live blog. You can find that on our website at australiainstitute.org.au, where Amy Ramikis, formerly of The Guardian, is going to keep you up to date every day that Parliament is sitting on what's going on and what you need to know about. So check that out today. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America, particularly if, like me, you're pretty much constantly stressed out by what President Donald Trump is going to do next, there's some amazing podcasts that'll keep you up to date on everything you need to know. Thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks again for your time, George. And we'll see you all next week for Policy School. Thanks so much. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.